So can you be completely, 100% true to yourself, authentically following your own internal compass, and still actually be the villain of the story?
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Because today we're tearing apart this modern obsession with authenticity. We're looking at a document that argues your internal compass might, actually be leading you straight off a cliff.
Yeah, right off a cliff.
So welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. Our mission today is to explore a really deeply philosophical and theological study guide focused entirely on the concept of integrity.
And it's a fascinating piece of material. The document you sent us, it's just titled O3tacrity.pdf.
Catchy title, right?
Oh, very. But looking through the notes and just the structure of it, this isn't just a basic glossary of vocabulary words. It operates a lot more like a high-tension worksheet.
Yeah, it really does.
It's loaded with scriptures, these really tight definitions, and some genuinely uncomfortable questions that are designed to, well, to audit your behavior.
And it even features this incredibly evocative visual right at the top of the page. It's just a simple, gray stick figure, but it's striking this very active, almost combative pose.
Yeah, kind of like a martial arts dance or something.
Exactly. It looks like it's bracing for impact, which is just a perfect visual metaphor for a text that asks us to rigorously examine the foundation of our daily
It
actions.
really hits the tone.
It does. Now, before we jump in, I want to set the table for you, the listener. Because the source material is heavily rooted in Christian theology, I want to be super clear that our goal today isn't to, endorse this specific theological framework or preach it as absolute fact.
Right. We're looking at the architecture of the argument.
Exactly. We are here to impartially unpack the mechanics of it. We want to understand how this text constructs its case for what integrity is, and just as importantly, what it isn't. Okay, let's unpack this, because the very first concept we run into completely shatters how we casually use the word in everyday
We
conversation.
really do throw it around, don't we?
We do. We usually treat integrity as just like a fancy synonym for honesty.
Right. And what's fascinating here is how the source immediately separates those two concepts.
Mm.
It sets up a contrast that just forces you to rethink your own behavior right out of the gate.
Yeah.
It asks you to look at the difference between the statement, what I say is true, versus the statement, what I do is true.
And I have to admit, that distinction, it tripped me up at first. Because, if I'm telling the truth, shouldn't that automatically mean I have integrity?
Well, not according to the mechanics of this framework. What I say is true is just honesty.
Just honesty.
Right. Like if you steal a colleague's idea at work, and later, when confronted, you confess and say, yes, I stole that idea, you are being honest. You are accurately conveying factual information about the past.
But you definitely don't have integrity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You clearly did not operate with integrity. So the document takes us back to the Latin root of the word, which is integer.
Which is a math term.
It is.
Yeah, I remember from grade school, it means a whole number, right? One that isn't broken into fractions.
Precisely. It implies a state of wholeness, where a person is entirely undivided. The document defines this as a condition where there is absolutely no division between what is on the inside of a person and what is on the outside.
So it's fundamentally about the absence of hypocrisy.
Yes.
The way I visualize this integer concept is that having integrity means you aren't fractioned out into different personas.
What's a good way to put it?
Like, you aren't one fraction of yourself when you are sitting in a corporate boardroom, and then a totally different fraction when you are hanging out with your friends, and yet another fraction when you are entirely alone behind closed doors.
Right. You aren't compartmentalized.
Exactly. Your beliefs and your behaviors are one single unbroken number.
And the source drives this point home by listing out these specific pairings that just have to align. It says there can be no division between belief and behavior, between words and ways, between attitudes and actions, or between values and practice.
That's a high bar.
It's an incredibly high bar. If there is a disconnect in literally any of those pairings, you have fractured the integer.
Okay, but let me push back on that, or at least, play devil's advocate for a second. Because if integrity is just about your inside matching your outside, this whole idea of wholeness, doesn't that create a massive philosophical loophole?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting. What happens if your inner values are just, well, inherently terrible?
This raises an important question, and it is the exact trap the worksheet brilliantly anticipates.
Uh-huh.
It forces the reader to confront what we might call the authenticity paradox.
Right, because modern culture is absolutely obsessed with authenticity. We constantly hear phrases like, just be true to yourself or live your truth.
All the time.
But the document explicitly asks, and I'll just quote it, is it possible to do what is true to one's values and be unrighteous at the same time? And when I read that, I immediately thought of like the villain with
The
integrity.
villain with integrity.
Yeah, if someone truly deeply values selfishness and they act ruthlessly selfish 100% of the time, their inside perfectly matches their outside. They are an unbroken integer of pure selfishness. So under that first definition, do they have integrity?
Well, under a purely subjective definition, you could argue they possess a really dark kind of integrity.
Yeah.
The document maps this out using a behavioral equation. It presents the formula, walk equals beliefs slash values. Your walk being your daily actions.
Right.
So if your actions perfectly equal your subjective internal beliefs, you are being authentic. But the text dismantles this by pointing out that subjective authenticity is incredibly fragile and honestly often dangerous.
Extremely dangerous.
If your internal compass is fundamentally broken, following it perfectly is just going to march you and everyone around you straight off a cliff.
You can be authentically toxic.
Ex-
You see this all the time with people who excuse terrible behavior by saying, well, I'm just being brutally honest, that's who I am. They are completely true to themselves, but they leave this massive wake of destruction.
Which is why the framework argues that internal alignment isn't enough to make someone a good person. Integrity, in order to avoid being hurtful or unrighteous, it just cannot rely on whatever fluid feelings or values happen to be rattling around inside you on any given Tuesday.
Right, because our feelings change constantly.
They do. So it requires an objective, external standard. And this is the critical pivot point where the document moves from general philosophy into its specific Christian framework. It introduces a second, more robust equation, walk equals identity.
Okay, so instead of acting based on what you happen to value in the moment, you act based on a fixed identity that sits outside of your, fluctuating emotions.
Exactly.
And in the context of this specific source material, that objective baseline is defined as living as a child of God.
The text defines this as living by godly standards, principles, and values, no matter where you are, who you're with, or what the circumstances may be.
I really want to zero in on that phrase, no matter who you are with.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Because the source brings in some incredibly specific textual evidence to back this up, and the one that stood out to me the most is the reference to Matthew chapter 22, verse 16.
Oh, that's a great passage.
It's so interesting. It describes this tense historical moment where the Pharisees and the Herodians, who were essentially two rival political and religious factions that both fiercely opposed Jesus, they send their disciples to question him.
Right, they're trying to trap him.
Exactly. And they start by saying, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are." I just find the mechanics of that interaction fascinating. His enemies are the ones defining his integrity.
It carries massive weight, doesn't it?
Mm.
Because an endorsement from an opponent is far more rigorous than praise from a friend.
So true.
The enemies are actively trying to trap him in his words, yet they are forced to concede his behavioral consistency. And the specific phrasing they use is the key to the entire document. You aren't swayed by others.
I do struggle with that a little bit, though. Let's really look at that word unswayed. Isn't being completely unswayed by others just like another form of arrogance?
That's a fair question.
How does this framework differentiate between having righteous integrity and just being stubbornly refusing to listen to anyone else?
Well, that is a crucial distinction. In this theological framework, being unswayed doesn't mean you are unteachable or arrogant. It means your moral baseline doesn't shift simply to appease the audience in the room.
Ah, okay.
Think of it in a modern context. Imagine you were in a corporate boardroom and the CEO, the ultimate VIP, asks you to fudge the numbers on a quarterly report to make the company look better.
Right.
If your baseline is subjective or based on climbing the corporate ladder, you will be swayed by the power dynamics of that room. You will fracture your integer to please the boss.
Oh, I see. So being unswayed means you don't pay attention to their status when it comes to compromising the truth. Your behavior doesn't morph based on the pressure of the environment.
Exactly. The standard for all thoughts, words, and actions becomes securely anchored to the external identity. The paradigm of decision-making completely flips.
How so?
Well, the driving question is no longer, what do I want to do right now to survive this meeting? or what feels authentic to my current mood.
Mm.
The question the document demands you ask is, who am I imitating?
Who am I imitating? That tracks perfectly with the other scriptures the worksheet brings in. It cites Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, which explicitly instructs the reader to imitate God, displaying the same kind of sacrificial love that Jesus showed.
Right.
It's shifting the burden of defining goodness off of the flawed human and onto this divine standard.
And it reinforces that shift through multiple texts. It references Titus chapter 2, which outlines showing integrity in teaching, maintaining soundness of speech, and setting such a relentless example of doing good that opponents are ashamed because they have, quote, nothing bad to say.
Wow.
It's about building a track record that is completely unassailable from the outside.
And then it contrasts that with Proverbs 11 and 13, which state that the integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity. I love that word, duplicity.
It's a very descriptive word.
It is the literal opposite of the integer. It implies a duality, a two-faced approach to life.
And duplicity is just exhausting.
Oh, I bet.
Keeping track of which version of yourself you are supposed to be in which room, remembering which lies you told to which people, just to maintain your various compartmentalized personas, it ultimately collapses under its own weight. Which is why the proverb says it destroys the unfaithful.
But let's bring this down to earth for a minute. Living to an uncompromising, unswayed standard of sacrificial love, never being duplicitous, it sounds incredibly noble in theory.
Bleeker does.
You can read that on a PDF and nod your head. But this document doesn't let the reader just sit with the warm and fuzzy theory. It violently forces you to confront the friction of actually practicing it. So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
Yeah, the worksheet moves from abstract theology to Monday morning reality with a very jarring question. It asks, what are some consequences of living a life of integrity? Can integrity bring about negative consequences?
I think that is the most dangerous question in the entire packet.
Really? Why?
Because the honest answer, if we are looking at how the real world operates, is absolutely yes.
It really is a highly sobering moment in the text.
Think about it. If you refuse to be swayed by powerful people, if you refuse to engage in duplicity when everyone else in your industry is doing it to get ahead, there is a severe cost. It might cost you a promotion. It might cost you a friendship if you refuse to lie for someone. It will almost certainly cost you social standing at some point. And this circles me right back to that gray stick figure from the top of the page.
Oh, the martial arts guy.
Yeah. When I first looked at it, I couldn't figure out why it was standing in that weird, wide stance. But looking at it through the lens of negative consequences, it makes perfect sense. The figure is bracing for a headwind.
Bracing for the pushback.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's showing us that integrity isn't some passive, genetic trait you just inherently possess. It is an active daily stance you have to strike, and often you are striking it against the prevailing wind of your environment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the architectural brilliance of the worksheet lies. It elevates the concept of integrity, but it utterly refuses to romanticize it.
Right.
It explicitly warns the reader that integrity will not develop by chance, and it certainly will not happen overnight. It requires a deliberate, muscular choice every single day.
And it demands that choice right there on the page. It actually asks the reader a direct question. Will you now make the commitment to live out your identity? And it gives you options to circle. Yes, no, maybe, or don't know.
That's intense.
It forces you to commit to the bit.
And it goes even further than just circling a word. The final prompt doesn't let you off the hook with a vague, overarching promise to just be better.
Right.
It requires you to list specific, actionable steps you can take in one specific area of your life to reflect this undivided identity. It forces the high-minded theological concepts of sacrificial love to become practical.
Because moral knowledge is totally useless unless it is actually applied.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you can define the Latin root of integrity for a theology exam, but you cannot name one specific area in your life where you are actively applying it, you have fractured the integer. You are saying one thing, but your actions are doing another.
It really is a masterclass in holding a mirror up to whoever is reading it. We've gone on quite a journey today with this document, starting all the way back at the mathematical concept of wholeness.
The integer.
Yep. Then dismantling the very comfortable modern myth that being true to yourself is always a good thing, exploring the mechanics of an unswayed, objective baseline, and finally dropping right into the gritty, real-world consequences of living an undivided life.
It leaves the reader with absolutely nowhere to hide. You are forced to either integrate your beliefs and your actions, facing whatever headwinds come with that, or you must quietly accept your own duplicity.
Which brings us to the close of this custom deep dive. And we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, building on the source's core contrast between saying and doing.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine the scenario. If your integrity was put on trial today and the jury was strictly forbidden from hearing what you say you believe,
They can't hear your words.
not a single word. They are only allowed to look at the outside meaning. They can only judge you by the unedited footage of what you actually did over the last 24 hours. Based solely on your actions, would there be enough evidence to convict you of being a whole, undivided person?
Wow, that's a heavy question.
It really is. Thank you for sharing such a profound set of notes with us. Keep exploring those deep questions, and we'll see you next time.